I turned 101 years old last month, and there is one thing that still frightens me today. Not the fact of dying, but the idea of forgetting who I have been. My name is Aldo Ferretti. I am 101 years old, and I want to tell you how 3 small morning habits kept my mind alive when everything around me seemed to want to put it out. I am not saying this to boast. I am saying it because I know that you, or someone you love, is afraid of that fog that slowly descends on memory. And I look that fog in the eye from very close up. We need to go back nearly 20 years to understand where this story begins. I was 82 years old, still living in the house in Treviso where I had spent almost my entire life. That house with the inner courtyard and the fig tree that my wife Carla had planted on the day of our 30th. It was a November morning, cold the way mornings in northern Italy can be cold when autumn stops pretending to be summer. I had gotten up as usual, gone to the kitchen, put the mocha pot on the stove, and then I stopped in the middle of the kitchen without knowing why I was there. I could not remember what I was doing. I could not remember whether I had already made the coffee or whether I still had to make it. I looked at the mocha pot on the flame and could not connect that metal object to any precise thought. It lasted only a moment. It passed quickly, but it left something inside me that did not pass quite as quickly, a silent, cold fear that I had never felt before in all my life. I had lived through the war as a child. I had lost my father young. I had worked for 40 years in a foundry. I had buried Carla 6 years before that morning. I thought I knew what fear was, but that morning in the kitchen I discovered that there is a kind of fear that has no name, that makes no noise, and that enters you in silence. That evening I spoke with my daughter Giovanna, who at the time came to visit me twice a week. I told her what had happened, trying to make it small, to make it normal, the way you do when you are afraid of worrying someone you love. She listened without interrupting, then took my hands in hers and said, "Papa, we need to talk to the doctor." We went to see Dr. Molinari, my family doctor, who had been following me for years, a calm, precise man who never used words any bigger than necessary. He ran some tests, asked me questions, had me do some simple exercises, the kind where they ask you to remember 3 words and then ask you again a few minutes later. I still remember that moment. Apple, house, pen. I remembered them, but with effort, with a kind of effort I had never felt before. Dr. Molinari did not tell me I was losing my memory. He told me the signs were there, that they were still mild, that things did not necessarily have to get worse, but that I needed to be careful. He gave me some general advice, as one does in these situations, and told me to come back for a checkup after a few months. I left that office with Giovanna by my side, and we walked in silence for quite a while along the main street, with dry leaves being pushed by the wind against the doorways of the old houses. At a certain point she said, "How are you feeling, Papa?" And I answered, "Fine. I am fine." It was not true, but it was all I could say. In the weeks that followed, that silent fear began to change shape. It stopped being only fear and became something different, a kind of stubborn determination, the kind I know well, that I have had in my blood my whole life, that my mother used to call the hard head of the Ferrettis. I began to read, to look for information, to ask questions. I spoke with the son of a friend who worked at a hospital in Padua. I bought a few books, even though it now took me twice as long to finish them. I listened, I observed, I tried, and in the end I found 3 things, 3 morning habits, simple, almost ordinary, that together changed something inside me. I do not want you to think of them as miracle cures, because they are not. They are simply things I did every day with consistency for nearly 20 years, and here I am, at 101, telling you about them. The first thing I began almost by accident, and for many years I had not understood how important it was. Every morning, just after waking, still before getting out of bed, I would take a few minutes to remember, not to think about the future, not to make plans, not to worry about anything, just to remember. I always started with the same thing: Carla's name. Then the day we had met at the parish dance at St. Francis Church in 51. Then the dress she was wearing, blue with white buttons. Then my father's voice, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the Thursday meat sauce, the one with celery and rosemary that she always put in too much of. I was remembering deliberately, with attention, as if I were holding something fragile in my hands. I did not know it then, but what I was doing had a name. Doctors call it autobiographical memory stimulation. But I did not know that, and perhaps it was better that way, because I was not doing it as a medical exercise. I was doing it because I needed to feel that I was still myself, that my story was still there, intact, safe inside me. Every morning I would spend 10 to 20 minutes like that, still in bed, traveling back in time. And every morning, when I finally got up, I felt a little more solid, as if those memories were roots, and I needed to feel them beneath my feet before beginning the day. Over time, I came to understand that what I was doing every morning was also a form of gratitude. I was thanking my memory for what it still held, and perhaps that is why my memory continued to hold. The second habit arrived about a year after the visit to Dr. Molinari. One morning, while I was having breakfast with my usual cup of coffee and 2 slices of bread with apricot jam, I started thinking about something I had never done in my life: writing. Not keeping a diary in the traditional sense, not writing, "Today is Monday, I did this and that." I wrote one single thing every morning in the small notebook I had bought from the stationery shop at the end of the street. I wrote a memory, a precise memory, with all the details I could find. Sometimes they were big things: the day Giovanna was born, the waiting in the corridor, my mother-in-law's hands gripping my arm, the doctor's voice saying, "It's a girl, everything is fine." Sometimes they were small things: the way Carla stirred the risotto, always with that slow, circular movement that she said required patience and not hurry. The sound of the bells of St. Nicholas on Christmas morning. The cold of the metal handlebars of my bicycle in winter when I rode to the foundry at dawn. I wrote slowly, with my handwriting that over the years had become less precise, but no less mine. And while I wrote, something strange and wonderful happened. The memories became sharper. It was as if turning them into words fixed them more firmly, made them more real, more resistant, like taking a photograph of something that might otherwise fade. I wrote like that for years. I filled 16 notebooks. They sit on a shelf in the living room, arranged by year. Giovanna reads them sometimes and tells me they contained things she never knew about her father, stories I had never told her. This makes me think that those notebooks did not only save my memory, they also saved a piece of our family's history. The third habit is the one that surprised me most, because I would never have expected to find benefit in something like it. I have always been a practical, concrete man of the generation that does not talk much about itself and that considers reserve a virtue. And yet the third thing I began doing every morning, after the remembering and after the writing, was a conversation. Not just any conversation, a conversation with someone every day before the morning was over. In the beginning, it was almost always Giovanna, by phone. Then, as my grandchildren grew old enough, it was often them. Marco, the eldest, who was studying engineering in Bologna and would call me while waiting for the bus. Lucia, the youngest, who had my same stubbornness and who never stopped asking questions. With them, I talked about anything at all, what I had done the day before, something I had read, a memory that had come to me during the night. I did not understand at first why this did me good. I thought it was simply a matter of affection, of not feeling alone, and certainly that counted too. But there was something more. Talking, explaining, telling stories forces the brain to do an enormous amount of work. It must search for the right words. It must organize thoughts. It must keep the thread of the conversation. It must respond to what the other person says. It is a continuous, invisible exercise that does not seem like one because you simply call it having a chat. One day, many years later, I spoke about these 3 habits with the nephew of an old colleague from the foundry who had become a neurologist in Verona. I explained what I did every morning, feeling slightly embarrassed, as if I were confessing something naive. He listened carefully, then said that what I had done, without knowing it, corresponded in a surprising way to some of the guidelines that modern research offered for maintaining cognitive health in older adults. The stimulation of episodic memory, writing as a form of memory consolidation, social interaction as an exercise for the brain's executive functions. I was silent for a few seconds, then said, "My wife Carla would have said that common sense always arrives before science." He laughed, and I thought, he was right too, and that perhaps Carla had been right as well. I do not want you to think I am immune to everything, that my mind is that of a 30-year-old, that I have never had another moment of confusion or blankness. That is not the case. With age, certain slowdowns arrive, and it is pointless to pretend otherwise. There are days when I search for a word and do not find it immediately, when I put my keys somewhere and have to think for a moment before remembering where. But there is an enormous difference between the normal slowing that comes with years and that fog I had glimpsed in the kitchen that November morning. The fog has not returned, and I believe, with all the certainty left to me at 101, that these 3 habits have played their part in that. There is one thing I want to tell you, though, and it may be the most important thing of everything I have said until now. I did not begin doing these things because I was certain they would work. I began them because I was afraid, and because fear, when you do not let it paralyze you, can become the engine of something good. I began deliberately remembering each morning because I was afraid of forgetting. I began writing because I was afraid that the stories of my life would disappear without leaving a trace. I began talking with someone every day because I was afraid of the silence that advances when you live alone and stop having reasons to open your voice. Fear was not the enemy. It was the messenger. It was telling me there was still something to defend, something worth keeping safe. And I listened. I am 101 years old and my life is full of absences and losses, as is the life of anyone who gets this far. I lost Carla. I lost friends who were like brothers. I lost a world that no longer exists. But I still have my memories. I still have my words. I still have my grandchildren's voices on the phone in the morning. And every day that I wake up and remember who I am, where I have been and who I have loved, still seems to me a day worth living. I do not know how many mornings I have left. At 101, you do not make grand plans, but I know that tomorrow morning, when I open my eyes, the first thing I will do is think of Carla, of her blue dress with the white buttons, of the parish dance at St. Francis Church, and I will feel the roots beneath my feet again. That is all I have to say to you. Take it or leave it. But if there is anything that a life this long has taught me, it is that the most important things are always the simplest ones, and that the mind, like the heart, needs to be cared for every single day, not only when it begins to hurt. Good luck and good memory.